I still remember the first time I heard the word Deathworlder whispered through the corridors of our research station. I was young then, barely past my third molting cycle, and the term carried with it a weight that seemed to press down on everyone who spoke it. We Galaxy had spent millennia building our civilization in the comfortable embrace of our homeworld, Valera Prime, where the gravity sat at a gentle 0.7 standard, where the atmospheric pressure never fluctuated beyond the narrowest margins, where predators had long ago been catalogued, contained, and relegated to the distant memories of our evolutionary past. We had achieved what we believed was the pinnacle of civilization: safety, predictability, control. Our species had evolved in paradise, and we had worked tirelessly to ensure that paradise remained undisturbed. We knew nothing of struggle beyond the intellectual challenges we posed to ourselves in our laboratories and universities. We knew nothing of survival beyond ensuring our climate systems functioned optimally. We were soft, we were comfortable, and we were proud of it. When the Galactic Assembly first broadcast warnings about the death world scattered throughout our arm of the galaxy, we listened with the detached curiosity of academics examining a fascinating but distant phenomenon. These were worlds that should not, by all reasonable standards, harbor intelligent life. Planets where the gravity would crush our delicate bone structures like dried kelp beneath a boulder. Worlds where the atmosphere roiled with such violence that our entire capital city could be obliterated by what the inhabitants casually referred to as weather. Places where the native fauna were so aggressively evolved, so perfectly designed for killing, that our most advanced security drones would be considered prey. We studied these worlds from afar, our scientists inputting data into simulations, our philosophers debating the nature of consciousness that could emerge from such brutality, our politicians congratulating themselves on our species' good fortune to have avoided such a nightmarish evolutionary path. We saw death worlds as cosmic accidents, aberrations in an otherwise rational universe, and we thanked our ancestors for their wisdom in choosing a gentler path. The Deathworlders themselves were even more terrifying than the planets that spawned them. Each species we encountered through long-range observation seemed more impossibly resilient than the last. There were the Krathani, massive beings whose homeworld boasted gravity nearly 3 times standard, who could shrug off impacts that would pulverize our bodies into paste. The Zoloth, whose planet's radiation levels would sterilize our genetics within hours, yet they thrived, their cellular structures adapted to repair damage faster than it could accumulate. The Vorkwut, aquatic creatures from a world where the ocean pressures at their city's depths would compress our vessels into singularities, yet they moved through it with elegant ease. We catalogued them all, maintained our distance, and established protocols that kept us safely separated. The Galactic Assembly, in its wisdom, had created buffer zones, designated spaces where Deathworlders could interact with each other, but were politely discouraged from entering sectors populated by species like ours. It was not discrimination, we told ourselves. It was prudent risk management. We had surveyed our fragility and decided that discretion was the better part of survival. Then came the broadcasts about Earth, and everything we thought we understood about Deathworld shifted into a more horrifying focus. The initial surveys described a planet that seemed designed by some malevolent cosmic force specifically to torment its inhabitants. Earth's gravity was one standard, but that single number failed to capture the crushing reality for species like mine who had evolved in lighter conditions. The atmosphere was a toxic cocktail that included reactive oxygen, a molecule so corrosive that it literally aged cells through oxidation. The weather systems moved with chaotic violence, spawning cyclones that could level cities, droughts that could sterilize continents, floods that could reshape coastlines. The planet's geological activity meant the very ground could split open without warning, spewing superheated rock that incinerated everything in its path. The temperature fluctuations were so extreme that water, the universal solvent of life, could exist in all three states simultaneously across different regions of the planet. Earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, these were not ancient historical events on Earth, but regular occurrences that the dominant species simply factored into their urban planning. But even all of this paled in comparison to the most terrifying aspect of Earth, its biosphere. The planet was an arms race of evolutionary violence that had been running for billions of years. The survey teams reported ecosystems so competitive, so ruthlessly efficient at killing, that our xenobiologists initially refused to believe the data. Microorganisms that could dissolve flesh in hours. Plants that produce compounds specifically engineered to paralyze or poison. Insects with venom potent enough to kill creatures hundreds of times their size. Apex predators with reflexes, speed, and sensory systems that made the nearly perfect killing machines. The oceans contained creatures of such size and predatory efficiency that they haunted my dreams for cycles after I first saw the recordings. The land supported megafauna that could crush our exploratory vehicles as an afterthought. Even the microscopic world was a battlefield, with viruses and bacteria locked in endless cycles of infection and immunity. Earth was not a planet that supported life. Earth was a planet where life had to fight for every single moment of existence, where the price of weakness was immediate death, where adaptation was not an advantage, but the minimum requirement for survival. And at the top of this nightmare food chain, barely hanging on by what should have been impossible odds, was humanity. When we first learned of them, we added them to our list of species to avoid at all costs, filed away their data in our archives of cosmic horror stories, and congratulated ourselves once more on the wisdom of maintaining our distance. We feared Deathworlders, and we feared humans most of all, because Earth had made them into something we could barely comprehend. The war came without warning, as wars often do to civilizations that have forgotten the shape of conflict. The Skari swarm erupted from a dead region of space that we had long dismissed as empty, sterile, not worth the resources to fully survey. We had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and now we paid the price for our complacency. They arrived not as explorers or diplomats, but as locusts, consuming every resource in their path, strip mining planets down to their cores, harvesting biological matter with mechanical efficiency that made no distinction between willing participants and desperate refugees. The Skari were not warriors in any traditional sense. They did not seek glory, or territory, or ideology. They were consumers, their civilization nothing more than an ever-expanding appetite wrapped in advanced technology and distributed across millions of autonomous vessels. They had no central command to negotiate with, no political structure to appeal to, no cultural values to exploit. They simply arrived, consumed, and moved on, leaving barren husks of worlds in their wake. The first Galaxy colonies fell within weeks. Our defensive systems, designed primarily to manage navigation hazards and the occasional commercial dispute, were laughably inadequate against an enemy that didn't pause to acknowledge surrender. We watched the feats in horror as stations we had built over generations were reduced to component atoms in hours. Entire populations that had known nothing but peace and prosperity died without even understanding why. Our military, such as it was, consisted primarily of ceremonial guards and law enforcement drones calibrated for civil order, not existential warfare. We activated what defensive protocols we had, retrofitted civilian vessels with whatever weapons our engineers could improvise, and threw everything we had at the advancing swarm. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The Skari consumed our drones, analyzed their weaknesses, and adapted faster than we could innovate. Our energy shields, designed to protect against micrometeorites and radiation, collapsed under focus fire in seconds. Our hull materials, more than sufficient for the vacuum of space, or breached by their cutting beams as though they were tissue paper. Our targeting systems, optimized for precision docking maneuvers, struggled to track the chaotic swarm patterns of their attack formations. The Galactic Assembly convened emergency sessions as the Zgari pushed deeper into civilized space. But the species that gathered were fundamentally similar to mine. The Korathi, the Valendri, the Plenithai, all had evolved on gentle worlds, had built their societies on principles of cooperation and mutual benefit, had allowed their martial capabilities to atrophy over millennia of peace. We held councils, we debated strategies, we pooled our scientific knowledge to find weaknesses in the Zgari's approach. We failed. Every analysis revealed the same truth. We were too slow, too fragile, too dependent on infrastructure that the Zgari could simply ignore or destroy. Our greatest minds produced simulations that showed loss after loss, scenarios where our combined fleets bought days at best, hours more likely, before the swarm adapted and overwhelmed us. Our politicians spoke of evacuation plans, of preserving our knowledge and culture even if our civilizations burned, of maintaining hope in the face of mathematical certainty of extinction. I attended those sessions in my capacity as a research coordinator, and I watched species that prided themselves on reason and logic descend into barely controlled panic as they realized that all their advancement, all their philosophy, all their art and science would mean nothing if they could not survive. It was Ambassador Kelrath of the Plenithai who first spoke the unthinkable in open council. I was there, standing in the observation tier, when his voice cut through the desperate murmuring that had become our new normal. He suggested, in carefully measured tones that barely concealed his own fear at the proposition, that we should request assistance from the Deathworlder species we had so carefully isolated ourselves from. The silence that followed was absolute. Around me, I could see the same calculation happening in 100 different minds. We had spent generations teaching our youth to fear these species, to maintain distance, to see their very existence as a dangerous reminder of evolution's capacity for cruelty. We had built our entire spatial political structure around the premise that Deathworlders and civilized species should maintain separate spheres, interacting only through carefully controlled channels and buffer zones. Now, in our darkest hour, we were being asked to invite them into our most sacred spaces, to rely upon the very characteristics that terrified us for our salvation. The debate that erupted was bitter and desperate. Some argued that death at the hands of the Zgari was preferable to the contamination of our culture by Deathworlder influence. Others insisted that our technological superiority would allow us to control and direct these primitive warriors, using them as blunt instruments while maintaining our civilized values. Still others saw no choice at all, only the stark mathematics of survival that demanded we use every possible asset, no matter how uncomfortable it made us. The humans answered our call within hours of the Assembly's transmission, and their response contained no negotiations, no demands for payment or territorial concessions, no political maneuvering that we had expected based on our own diplomatic frameworks. They simply asked where we needed them and how soon. I read the transmission a dozen times, searching for the hidden clauses, the unspoken prices, the subtle manipulation that must surely be present. There was none. The humans had heard that sapient beings were dying, and they had responded with an immediacy that our own bureaucracy could never match. Within days, the first human fleets began arriving in assembly space, and I watched the live feeds with a mixture of hope and terror that I had never experienced before. Their ships were wronged by every aesthetic principle we had developed. Where our vessels were smooth, elegant curves optimized for efficiency and visual harmony, human ships were angular, brutal things covered in armor plating and weapon emplacements. Where we used standardized designs refined over generations, each human vessel seemed unique, retrofitted and modified with a chaotic creativity that suggested constant adaptation. They moved through space with an aggressive confidence that unsettled our traffic control systems designed for polite, predictable navigation patterns. They broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously, their communications filled with jargon and abbreviations that our translators struggled to parse. They were alien in ways that went beyond mere physical differences, operating on cultural assumptions that seemed fundamentally incompatible with our own. And yet, as I watched those brutal ships take up defensive positions around our most vulnerable colonies, as I saw them establish patrol patterns that our analysts reluctantly admitted were tactically superior to anything we had conceived, I felt something shift in my understanding of the universe. We had feared Deathworlders because they reminded us of our own fragility. But perhaps, I thought as human vessels moved to intercept the next wave of Skari attackers, perhaps that fear had blinded us to what they could offer if we were brave enough to accept it. The first joint operation was a disaster, but not for the reasons our military theorists had predicted. We had assumed that coordination would be impossible, that the humans' primitive command structure and our sophisticated tactical networks would be fundamentally incompatible, that their aggressive nature would lead to reckless charges that left our formations vulnerable. We were wrong on every count. The problem was not that the humans couldn't understand our tactics. The problem was that our tactics were inadequate for actual warfare, and the humans were too polite to say so directly during the planning sessions. Admiral Koresh, our fleet coordinator, had designed what she called a perfectly balanced defensive matrix to protect the Galaxy mining colony at Antares 7. Our ships would form a layered sphere, each vessel positioned at mathematically optimal distances to create overlapping fields of fire while maintaining safe fallback corridors. The human forces, under Commander Elizabeth Chin, would serve as a mobile reserve that could be deployed to reinforce weak points as the Skari assault developed. It looked elegant in simulation, a crystalline structure of mutual support and geometric precision. The humans had listened to the briefing in silence, their faces displaying what our cultural liaisons assured us was respectful attention, and had agreed to follow our operational framework. When the Skari arrived, they tore through our perfect formation in 11 minutes. They didn't attack the way our simulations had predicted, spreading their forces evenly to probe for weaknesses. Instead, they concentrated their entire swarm on a single quadrant, overwhelming our ships there through simple numerical superiority before we could redeploy to compensate. The Skari didn't care about elegant tactics or mathematical optimization. They cared about overwhelming force applied at the point of maximum vulnerability, and our formations created those vulnerabilities in the name of systematic coverage. I watched from the command center as our vessels began signaling distress, their shields collapsing under focus fire, their hull integrity failing, their crews initiating evacuation procedures that would never be fast enough. Admiral Koresh was calling for orderly withdrawal, following our doctrine that preserved ship integrity over territorial control, when Commander Chen's voice cut across the command frequency with a bluntness that bordered on insubordination. She said, with the kind of certainty that only comes from actual combat experience, that if we retreated now, the Skari would simply overtake our evacuation ships, and we would lose everything anyway. She requested permission to engage freely, and something in her tone made Admiral Koresh grant it despite every protocol screaming otherwise. What happened next defied every principle of warfare we had studied in our academies and research institutes. The human ships abandoned formation entirely, scattering into what appeared to be complete chaos, but what I would later learn was called fluid engagement doctrine. They stopped trying to maintain geometric precision and instead began moving like a school of predatory fish, each vessel operating semi-independently but somehow maintaining a coordinated assault that kept the Skari off balance. They used thrust patterns that our engineers had deemed inefficient, burning fuel at rates that violated our resource conservation guidelines, but those wasteful maneuvers let them dodge targeting solutions that would have destroyed our more predictable vessels. They fired weapons while maneuvering in ways that our stability algorithms flagged as dangerous, accepting minor accuracy penalties in exchange for never presenting a stationary target. They communicated in rapid bursts of abbreviated language that seemed more like instinct than planning, yet their ships moved in synchronized patterns that suggested deep mutual understanding. And most disturbing of all, they deliberately took damage, some vessels drawing fire to create openings for others, coordinating their shield failures in ways that spread the Zgari's attention while preventing any single human ship from being destroyed. I stood in the command center, watching the tactical display with growing disbelief as the human vessels executed maneuvers that should have been impossible. One destroyer, the UNS Manila, had lost 70% of its shield strength but continued engaging, its commander calmly reporting damage percentages while somehow still directing fire at Zgari weak points that our sensors hadn't even identified. A frigate designated Hellas Planitia was venting atmosphere from 3 hull breaches, yet its crew had apparently sealed themselves in combat-ready sections and continued operating their weapons systems at full efficiency. The carrier Beijing had deployed its fighter craft in a pattern that violated every safety regulation we had regarding small craft operations, sending pilots into crossfire situations that our doctrine classified as suicide missions, yet those pilots were systematically dismantling Zgari attack formations with a precision that made our drone swarms look clumsy by comparison. These were not the actions of beings who feared death. These were the actions of beings who had made peace with its possibility and decided that the mission mattered more. It was horrifying and inspiring in equal measure, and I realized that we Galaxy had never truly understood what we were asking when we called for military aid. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it ended, the Zgari swarm had been driven back with losses they deemed too costly to sustain. We had not lost a single colony ship, though several human vessels were so badly damaged that they had to be abandoned and scuttled. The price of our victory was written in the casualty reports that came through after action. The human forces had suffered 47 dead and over 200 wounded, injuries ranging from radiation exposure to explosive decompression to what the medical reports clinically described as traumatic impact injuries from combat maneuvering. We Galaxy had suffered 0 casualties, protected by the cordon of human ships that had put themselves between us and annihilation. I attended the memorial service the humans held for their fallen, and I watched as Commander Chen read names, as crew members stood in silence, as no one wept or wailed but everyone carried a weight that I could feel even across the vast cultural divide between us. They mourned not as victims of random tragedy, but as warriors who had accepted a bargain and honored it even unto death. And I understood, finally, that we had not hired mercenaries or enlisted primitive allies. We had been saved by people who possessed a courage that my species had forgotten we once needed, a willingness to endure pain we could not imagine, a commitment to protecting others that transcended any contract or obligation. The humans had not asked for territory or resources or political power. They had asked only where we needed them, and they had paid in blood for our survival. My pride, my species' pride in our civilized sophistication, crumbled under the weight of that realization. We had thought ourselves advanced because we had eliminated violence from our society. The humans had shown us that we had merely hidden from it, and when it came for us anyway, we had been helpless until those we looked down upon arrived to shield us with their lives. The cultural exchange program began not as a formal diplomatic initiative, but as a practical necessity born from continued cooperation. After Antares 7, the human fleets integrated more deeply into our defensive networks, their ships stationed at critical junctures throughout assembly space, their commanders participating in strategy sessions alongside our admirals and tactical theorists. The initial discomfort was palpable on both sides. Our representatives would flinch slightly when humans entered a room with their heavy footfalls and broad gestures, the unconscious wariness of prey animals encountering predators. The humans, for their part, had to consciously moderate their movements in our stations, learning to navigate environments designed for beings half their mass, sitting carefully in furniture that groaned under their weight, speaking in modulated tones that seemed to require constant effort. But necessity bred familiarity, and familiarity slowly, cautiously, began to breed understanding. I became involved in the exchange program almost by accident when my research division was assigned to analyze human tactical doctrine for potential integration into assembly training protocols. What I discovered changed everything I thought I understood about intelligence, adaptation, and survival. Human military doctrine, when I first examined it, appeared to be a contradictory mess of principles that violated our logical frameworks at every level. They emphasized both rigid discipline and individual initiative, somehow expecting their personnel to follow orders absolutely, while also making independent decisions when circumstances changed. They trained for scenarios that our probability matrices rated as statistically irrelevant, preparing their forces for contingencies so unlikely that our resource allocation algorithms would never justify the investment. They maintained redundant systems and backup plans for situations that should never occur if primary protocols were properly followed, operating under the assumption that things would go wrong rather than optimizing for ideal conditions. It seemed wasteful, inefficient, the product of minds that couldn't grasp the elegant certainty that came from proper analysis and planning. But then I began attending their training exercises, watching human soldiers run through simulations that our experts had designed to be unsolvable, and I witnessed something that our models could not explain. When the scenarios collapsed into chaos, when the parameters shifted beyond any reasonable prediction, when the right answer became impossible to calculate, the humans thrived. Lieutenant Marcus Webb became my guide into this alien mindset, assigned to explain human military culture to a xenobiologist who had never fired a weapon or felt the adrenaline of combat. He was patient with my questions, amused by my confusion, and relentlessly honest about the principles that guided his thinking. I asked him why humans trained for highly improbable scenarios, and he looked at me with genuine surprise, as if the question itself revealed a fundamental gap in understanding. He said that nothing ever goes according to plan, that the enemy gets a vote, that the universe doesn't care about your carefully calculated probabilities when it throws a solar flare or a hull breach or a complete intelligence failure into your operation. He explained that humans didn't train for the most likely outcome. They trained to handle whatever actually happened, because on Earth, survival had never been about having the perfect plan. It had been about adapting when plans failed, about maintaining function when systems broke down, about finding solutions in the terrible space between what you expected and what you got. He showed me combat recordings from human history, from wars fought on Earth before they reached the stars, and I watched soldiers make impossible decisions in fractions of a second, watched them coordinate without communication when their systems failed, watched them continue fighting when any rational calculation would suggest immediate surrender. I began to understand that what we had interpreted as chaos in human tactics was actually a different kind of order, one based not on predetermined patterns, but on rapid adaptation to emergent circumstances. Where we designed systems that worked optimally under specific conditions and failed when those conditions changed, humans designed systems that expected change and built resilience into every layer. Their ships had redundant backups for critical systems, not because they expected the primary systems to fail, but because they knew that in actual combat, something always failed. Their command structure had clear hierarchies, but also expected junior officers to take initiative when communications broke down, trusting in shared understanding of objectives rather than requiring constant guidance. Their soldiers trained not to execute a perfect plan, but to accomplish the mission regardless of what went wrong, prioritizing adaptability over precision. It was the product of a world that had taught them, across millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of civilization, that the universe was fundamentally hostile and unpredictable, that survival required constant vigilance, that the price of complacency was death. We Galaxy had built our society in a garden and wondered why we couldn't understand the mindset of species forged in a forge. The transformation in my own thinking came gradually, and then all at once during a joint training exercise that paired Galaxy officers with human advisors. I watched as Captain Sorth, one of our most decorated tactical theorists, designed an elegant defensive scenario that balanced resource allocation against threat assessment with mathematical precision. The humans listened, nodded, and then quietly suggested modifications that seemed to introduce unnecessary redundancy and wasteful positioning. Captain Sorth explained, with the patience of an academic addressing a promising but confused student, why those modifications would reduce overall efficiency. Commander Wei, the human advisor, smiled and suggested they run both scenarios in simulation. The first run went exactly as Captain Sorth predicted. Perfect efficiency, minimal resource expenditure, textbook execution. Then Commander Wei introduced a variable that our planning hadn't accounted for, a solar flare that disrupted communications for 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, Captain Sorth's formation, dependent on real-time coordination, began to fracture, ships unable to adapt to changing Skari attack patterns without central guidance. The engagement turned from a perfect victory to a catastrophic loss in less than a minute. Commander Wei reset the simulation and ran the modified scenario. When the same solar flare hit, the human-designed formation, with its redundant positioning and pre-coordinated fallback patterns, absorbed the disruption without significant losses. The ships operated semi-independently, maintaining enough cohesion to accomplish the objective even when the elegant coordination network failed. I saw the moment Captain Sorth understood, the same moment I did. We had been designing systems for a universe that existed only in our theoretical models, a pristine environment where variables behaved predictably and contingencies could be fully anticipated. The humans designed for reality, messy and chaotic and fundamentally hostile to perfection. They assumed that things would break, that plans would fail, that the unexpected would happen precisely when it would hurt the most. And because they assumed the worst, they survived when it arrived. It was a lesson written into their very genetics, coded into their culture through countless generations of evolutionary and historical trauma. Earth had taught humanity that the universe didn't care about your plans, your preferences, or your survival. It had taught them to endure anyway, to adapt, to persist through conditions that should have killed them a million times over. We had called them primitive, looked down on their crude ships and violent culture, pitted them for the harsh world that had spawned them. But they had learned lessons in that crucible that we, in our comfortable paradise, had never needed to know. Until the Skari came. Until our perfect plan shattered against the reality of existential warfare. Until we needed allies who understood, in their bones, that survival was not a mathematical certainty, but a constant struggle that required resilience, adaptability, and a willingness to endure pain that beings like me could barely comprehend. The humans had become our teachers in the subjects that mattered most, and we were finally humble enough to be their students. The war against the Skari raged for 2 more standard years after Antares 7, and in that time, everything about the Galactic Assembly changed in ways both subtle and profound. Human fleets became permanent fixtures in our defensive architecture, their vessels no longer segregated to buffer zones, but integrated into our most critical installations. Human advisors took positions in our tactical planning centers, their insights gradually reshaping doctrine that had remained unchanged for generations. Human culture began seeping into assembly space through the informal channels that always form when different peoples live and work in close proximity. Our youth started consuming human entertainment, fascinated by stories of survival against impossible odds, drawn to narratives of courage and sacrifice that our own literature had long since abandoned in favor of philosophical meditation and aesthetic contemplation. Our engineers began adopting human design principles, adding redundancy to systems they had always assumed would function perfectly, building in failure modes and backup protocols that had seemed wasteful before we learned their value through hard experience. Our military academies invited human instructors to teach courses on adaptive tactics, asymmetric warfare, and psychological resilience under combat stress, subjects that had not existed in our curriculum because we had convinced ourselves we would never need them. I found myself at the center of this cultural transformation, my role evolving from xenobiologist studying Deathworlders species to something more like a translator between fundamentally different worldviews. I spent months embedded with human forces, living aboard their vessels, attending their briefings, eating their food that was often too rich and heavily spiced for my system, but that I learned to tolerate out of respect for their hospitality. I interviewed hundreds of human soldiers, officers, engineers, medics, trying to understand not just what they did but why they did it, what drove them to volunteer for assignments that carried substantial risk of death or injury, what enabled them to function in conditions that would have paralyzed me with fear. The answers I received were as varied as the individuals I spoke with, but certain themes emerged with consistent clarity. They spoke of duty, of protecting others who couldn't protect themselves, of honoring fallen comrades by ensuring their sacrifice meant something. They spoke of purpose, of finding meaning in struggle, of the satisfaction that came from enduring hardship for a cause larger than individual survival. They spoke of connection, of bonds forged in crisis that went deeper than peacetime relationships, of trust built through shared danger that created a sense of belonging they valued above comfort or safety. What struck me most profoundly was the human's relationship with fear itself. We Galaxy had built our civilization around the elimination of fear, creating environments so safe and predictable that we rarely experienced the emotion outside of entertainment scenarios. The humans had no such luxury on Earth, and they had developed something we had lost, the ability to feel fear and act anyway. I watched human pilots launch into battle zones where their tactical computers calculated 70% casualty probability, watched them check their weapons and equipment with steady hands despite the fear I could see in their eyes, watched them execute their missions with professional precision even as their biometric readings showed stress hormones at levels that would have incapacitated me. I asked one pilot, Lieutenant Yuki Nakamura, how she managed it, and she looked at me with genuine confusion, as if the question itself didn't make sense. She said that fear was just information, data your body provided about potential danger, and that you acknowledged it, incorporated it into your decision-making, and then did what needed to be done anyway. She said that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it control your choices, that every human who went into combat was terrified, but they went anyway because people were counting on them. It was a simple statement that revealed an entire philosophical framework built around accepting risk, managing fear, and finding strength in the spaces where safety could not be guaranteed. The turning point in the war came at the Valera Prime itself. When the Zgari launched an assault on my homeworld with forces they had apparently been massing for months in a dead system beyond our sensor range. It was their largest offensive, a calculated strike at the symbolic and strategic heart of assembly space, and our defense grid, even bolstered by human vessels, was outnumbered 3-1. I was on the surface when the assault began, and I watched the orbital battle through the observation dome of our Planetary Defense Coordination Center, watched the tactical displays light up with thousands of Scari vessels overwhelming our perimeter, watched the probability matrices calculate our destruction with mathematical certainty. Admiral Koresh transmitted evacuation orders for non-essential personnel, but I stayed at my post, unable to look away as human ships threw themselves into defensive formations around our planet with a desperation that matched our own. Commander Chen's flagship, the UNS Thermopylae, took up position directly above our capital city, making itself the primary target to draw fire away from the surface installations. I watched that ship endure punishment that should have torn it apart, watched its shields fail, and its armor ablate, and its systems cascade into failure, and I watched it continue fighting, its crew maintaining fire discipline even as they prepared for catastrophic decompression. What saved us was not superior technology, or brilliant tactics or mathematical optimization. What saved us was the simple fact that humans refused to quit. When our vessels exhausted their ammunition, human ships shared their reserves. When our power systems failed from sustained combat stress, human engineering teams transferred portable generators even while under fire. When our formations began to collapse from coordinated Scari pressure, human vessels filled the gaps, accepting damage that should have forced them to retreat but somehow maintaining their positions through sheer determination. I watched the battle rage for 18 hours, watched humans fight with injuries that should have incapacitated them, watched them jury-rig solutions to problems that had no solutions in our technical manuals, watched them coordinate across damaged communication systems using protocols they seemed to improvise in real time. And slowly, impossibly, I watched the tide turn. The Scari had calculated that we would break, that our civilized forces would follow doctrine and retreat when losses exceeded acceptable thresholds, that the humans would eventually abandon a losing position to preserve their forces. They were wrong. The humans had come to protect Valera Prime, and they did not leave. The Scari, for the first time in the war, withdrew first, their swarm intelligence apparently deciding that the cost of continuing the assault exceeded potential gains. They had met an enemy who would not break, who absorbed casualties that should have destroyed morale, who fought with a ferocity that matched their own hunger but was directed by intelligence and purpose instead of blind consumption. In the aftermath, as rescue teams worked through the debris field and medical stations overflowed with wounded from both our species, as engineers began cataloging the damage and planners started calculating reconstruction timelines, I found Commander Chen in a medical bay where she was being treated for what human doctors clinically described as moderate radiation exposure, but which would have been instantly fatal to someone like me. She was conscious, calm, filling out after-action reports on a datapad even as medics worked to stabilize her cellular degradation. I asked her why humans had sacrificed so much for a world that was not their own, for a species that had spent generations fearing and avoiding them, for people who had looked down on them as primitive and violent. She looked at me with eyes that had seen more combat than I could imagine and said something I will remember until my last breath. She said that humans knew what it meant to be afraid, to feel powerless, to face threats that promised annihilation. She said that Earth had taught them these lessons in 1,000 different ways across their entire history. She said that when they saw others experiencing that fear, that powerlessness, they recognized it as their own story told in different voices. And she said that if humans could use the strength Earth had forced them to develop to protect others from that experience, then maybe all the suffering, all the violence, all the brutality of their evolution had meant something beyond mere survival. I left that medical bay understanding something fundamental about Deathworlders that I had missed in all my years of academic study and clinical observation. They were not primitive beings we should pity or dangerous creatures we should fear. They were people who had been forced to develop strengths we had never needed, who carried burdens we could barely comprehend, who offered to share those strengths freely if we were brave enough to accept them. The war with the Skari eventually ended not with a decisive military victory, but with the gradual realization by their swarm intelligence that continued assault on assembly space cost more than it gained, that the combined forces of our species and humanity had made consumption unsustainable. The Skari withdrew to deep space, and we began the long work of rebuilding both our infrastructure and our understanding of ourselves. Humanity remains integrated into assembly space, their ships protecting our borders, their advisors reshaping our doctrine, their culture enriching our own in ways we are still discovering. And I, once a xenobiologist who studied Deathworlders from a safe distance, now count humans among my closest friends and most trusted colleagues. We feared them because they reminded us of our own fragility, because their existence challenged our assumptions about civilization and progress, because we had confused comfort with advancement and violence with barbarism. We know better now. We know that humanity's strength comes not from their capacity for violence, but from their refusal to let violence break them, from their ability to endure what should be unendurable and emerge still capable of compassion, still willing to protect others, still fundamentally decent despite everything their world did to them. My species feared Deathworlders until humans became our allies, and in becoming our allies, they taught us that the true measure of civilization is not how well you avoid hardship, but what you do when hardship finds you anyway.